Hello, faithful politics listeners and watchers. Thanks so much for joining us here today. We have an exciting interview today with Shaun Casey. He was a special representative for global and religion and global affairs at the U.S. Department of State and a director of the Office of Religion and Global Affairs from 2013 to 2017. He's taught at Harvard Divinity School, Wesley Theological Seminary, and the Walsh School of Foreign Service, and directed the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. Shaun, it's such a pleasure to have you on the program today. How are you doing?
Thanks, Josh. I'm doing great. It's a nice, hot spring day here in the Washington, D.C. area, but it's great to be with
Ah,
you.
yeah, so I'm in Richmond, so I'm not too far from you there.
Yeah.
So it's hot here as well. It's going to be 86 today. I'm like, I don't need this kind of heat yet. It's only April 6th, Shaun. What are we supposed to do with this?
That's right. I don't know. I think we just have to surrender and roll with the punches.
And just surrender and roll with the punches. That's right. So we're going to get into talking about your book today. It's called Chasing the Devil at Foggy Bottom, which I love the title, and I'm super interested. And of course, we'll have you talk through the book and kind of talk. We'll just have a free flowing conversation of questions, and but super interested in finding more about this and what inspired you and your research and everything. So, but before we get into that, I mean, it looks like, man, you have like you have a rap sheet, a good rap sheet that's
Yeah.
like that puts me to shame. So what's going on here with the religion and global affairs? Talk to us a little bit about that. What brought you to that? What got you into this place?
Well, I have a chapter in the book called "Male, Pale, and Not Quite Yale," and that's a riff on the historic knock on the State Department that it was usually the folks who worked there were male, pale, and had gone to Yale. So male, pale, and Yale, and that's not my pedigree, but it is sort of my pedigree. So I was born in a small cotton farming town in southeast Missouri, about 15 miles west of the Mississippi River, and that's not the usual recruiting ground for the State Department when it goes looking for diplomats or diplomats in training.
Yeah, right.
And but I grew up in a family in the Churches of Christ, which is a small evangelical denomination that some people may be familiar with, and sort of two or three of the twin topics at the Casey dinner table. One was religion, and the other was politics, and the third one, frankly, was education. I come from a family of teachers, and both my parents worked on farms, grew up in farm families there in southeastern Missouri. And it's a long way from the boot heel of Missouri to Foggy Bottom, where the main headquarters of the U.S. State Department is. And so I tell the story kind of how I got from that peculiar corner of the world to the other peculiar corner of the world, Washington, D.C. And it was a very winding path. But I was a paper boy from about age 11 through 13, where I delivered the Louisville Courier Journal in the small town of Paducah, Kentucky, that we moved to when I was 4. And so I began most mornings at 5 a.m. reading the Courier Journal way back in the 70s.
Mm.
And even though that's a, not particularly known as a cosmopolitan, internationally aware part of the world, that newspaper was really a window into what was going on in my life and my world at that time. And Vietnam dominated the headlines. So you couldn't read that paper from ages 11 to 13 without being impressed by the fact that there were powerful things going on globally that were having a direct impact on where we live there in this semi-rural part of the world. And then you map onto that, serious commitment to church, and to education. And so those were the factors that influenced me very early on to being attuned not to just local politics, but also national and global politics. And then you fast forward a number of decades, and I had the good fortune to attend Harvard University, where I studied both divinity and foreign policy. And my first teaching job out of my doctoral program was in Washington, D.C., at a United Methodist seminary, where I helped train pastors for over a decade. And we were a global seminary in a global city, and part of my research interest, my scholarly interest had to do with America's role in the world and U.S. foreign policy. So all those fit together. And then I had the great fortune to meet John Kerry just after he had lost the presidential race in 2004.
Mm.
And we were introduced to one another by a mutual friend, Mike McCurry, who had been Bill Clinton's press secretary back in the Clinton administration. And Kerry has this really powerful curiosity about the role of religion in the world. He was actually a person of deep faith. I talk a lot about that in the book too. And so when he became Secretary of State in 2013, one of the things he discovered early on was that he had the legal authority to launch a religion advisory office in the State Department. And he and I had interacted for the previous 8 years. And when he was told this, he interrupted the briefer and said, "Hold on a second." And he turned to his chief of staff, who I'd known for 8 years as well. And he said, "Call Shaun and see if you can twist his arm and have him come in and launch this Office of Religion and Global Affairs." And I don't know, it took about 30 seconds of negotiating on my part before we had a deal. But anyway, that's
That's
kind of
awesome.
the quick and dirty tour about how I got from this tiny town in southeast Missouri to the seventh floor of the U.S. State Department.
That's amazing. So you wrote this book, and it's, if I understand right, it's a memoir
Yeah.
and it's about your time. So what? Tell me about the title. That's an interesting title. Why did you choose to make it "Chasing the Devil"? What does that tell us about the State Department?
Yeah.
Is are all the conspiracy theories true?
Yeah.
That there's devil worship and satanic worship going on in the
Right.
government? Just let us know.
Yeah.
I have to know.
Well, so the full title of the book, Chasing the Devil at Foggy Bottom: The Future of Religion in American Diplomacy. And so let me
Mm,
give you a little background first of why it's important that the U.S. government have a capacity to understand diplomatic um,
yes, please do.
diplomatic implications of religious communities. So first of all, we were not there to promote religion. We were not there to represent any particular view, Christian or otherwise. We were there because if you think back to 2006, Madeleine Albright wrote a book after she stepped down as Secretary of State, and it was called "The Mighty and the Almighty." And what she said was that when she was Secretary of State, when some conflict or something interesting happened around the world, she could pick up the phone and call an army of historians, political scientists, economists, diplomats to give her technical advice on what our foreign policy should do. But when something happened that was related to religious communities, there was nobody on the end of the phone. She could pick up the phone and try to dial somebody, but there was
Mm,
nobody in the State Department to advise her. And then she listed, a number of issues that popped up where religious dynamics were part of a particular diplomatic problem or diplomatic issue.
which I'm sure happens quite a bit,
Well, it does.
especially in certain parts of the world.
Well, yeah, exactly. Now, it's not everywhere. So we weren't there looking for religion in places where religion didn't have any real diplomatic impact. But it was John Kerry's view then, after his almost 40 years in the U.S. State Department working on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that American diplomacy had failed because it ignored religious dynamics in many contexts. And for us, the greatest example was the
Mm,
Iraq War.
mm,
And I'm old enough to have remembered the Vietnam War, which was a terrible, terrible foreign policy failure on our part. And I think Iraq rates up there is certainly the worst political decision we have made diplomatically since the
wow.
Vietnam War. And
I got to
I,
hear more about that once you're done with this one.
well,
I'm
I've got a whole
curious as to why you
chapter.
say that.
Yeah, I've got a whole chapter in the book that shows that the willful ignorance of the religious dynamics in Iraq led to cascading failure after cascading failure on the part of our government and our
Oh my
policy.
goodness.
So, Secretary Kerry often said we ignore the power of religion at our peril. And I certainly came to believe, and as I illustrate in the book, Iraq is just a case study on how, if you really want to screw something up, this is a good example. And the religious dynamics were front and center at a lot of those mistakes that we made. The much harder question, though, is how do you do this work? And here I turn to an aphorism that one of my teachers at Harvard Divinity School said, Father Brian Hare. He said, governments investigating religion internationally is akin to brain surgery. It may be
Mm.
necessary, but it can be fatal if not done well.
Oh my goodness, dude!
So,
What a apt analogy, huh?
right. So that was always bouncing around in my brain as we did our work. So the bulk of the book is really trying to answer the question, how should the US government do this kind of work, keeping in
Yes.
mind that it can be done poorly and it can lead to mischief and it can lead to creating problems on its own. And what I do is I tell a number of stories of countries we went into and global issues that we worked on where assessing the religious dynamics, engaging the religious communities and leaders and people on the ground led to a better, stronger U.S. foreign policy. And that's really the thesis of the book. Now, I have not answered your original question. I'm aware of that. As a former
It's
minister
okay. I
and
love
a
hearing the
professor.
thesis of the book. Yes.
Well, so when I was working on the titles as I was writing the book, I told a friend, I think I'm going to call it "Chasing the Devil at Foggy Bottom," and his first response was, "Now, which undersecretary are you calling the devil?" I said, "No, no, 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 that's not what I mean." Um, but basically, so I every every talk I've given, and I've given many talks now about the book in the last 8 weeks. Inevitably, somebody asks that question. Now, okay, Shaun, really tell us, who are
Right.
you calling the devil?
Right.
And,
Who
and
is
so
the
I
devil?
so my cheap answer, which I'll give you now and see if you let me get away with it, is buy the book and read the book. At the end, in the last chapter, I tell you what I mean by that. But I'm not
That
picking out.
makes sense.
I'm not picking out a single person. I'm not pointing a finger and saying, uh, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. So if you're looking for some sort of tell-all, that the State Department was
Dang it.
running some
I
kind of
thought you were going to prove that there was a lizard person at the
no,
top of the
no.
State Department.
Maybe I would have sold more books if I had done that, but that's not what it's about. But anyway, I'm going to let you buy the book and read it if you're dying to get that answer.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, here's the thing. I've been working through the book. I have, they gave me a copy in advance of this and I love it. And, some questions I have though. So the main thesis of your book, if I'm to understand it correctly, is that you're trying to show why it's important for the United States to not ignore religious implications and religious thinking when it comes to its foreign policy and how it relates to different countries, which I think is really brilliant. How did you exactly okay, Sean Carey asked you, he talked to you about it. So how did you start this? How did you develop this? How did you make this happen? What was that process like for actually getting something done in the government?
Well, yeah, and that is, one of the subtexts of the book is that it's possible to bring innovation into the bureaucracy. Now, we all have had our ears and brains stuffed with stories of the failure of the U.S. government because it's so big
Right.
and it's so bureaucratic, and you can get elected the local dog catcher if you're an anti-government kind of person, and that certainly bureaucracies have their problems. But what I think we showed was it's possible to innovate, to be nimble, to have a flat organization where you don't have 17 layers of bureaucrats from top to bottom. And
Mm.
so I came in. I remember the very first day when I joined the State Department, and I am literally the only employee on a planet of almost 8 billion people, and goodness knows how many forms of religiosity. The notion that there's one person who is the religion person is laughable on the face of it. And I felt more than a few
Yes.
moments of just existential fear because I knew what I knew about religion in the world, and I knew what a tiny fraction of the world's religiosity I had a handle on.
Yes.
So I had to build a team, and it really was trying to find the smartest people I could. And what I needed were people who understood religion in different contexts or specific contexts, because just
Mm.
because you're an expert on, say, Islam in Dearborn, Michigan, doesn't mean you have a handle on what lived Islam is like in Baghdad.
Yes.
And
Right.
same that's so all religions that have more than two members are internally plural. You have diversity. You know, you're a Christian minister. You know that you don't represent all denominations, but indeed the
No.
thousands of Christian denominations.
Of course.
And so all religions are internally plural. So I needed people who knew religion in context. And the perfect person would have studied a specific religion in school or graduate school, perhaps had lived in a country where they interacted with
Mm,
folks. They may themselves may have been a member of a particular religion, but I couldn't hire
sure.
people because of their own religious affiliation. And
Right.
I needed people too who also had a security clearance, which narrows the field tremendously. That uh,
I, I
so
imagine that it does.
yeah, so it took us over a year to get fully staffed. So we sort of, as the old phrase goes, we built the airplane while we were flying it, and so we started out
Right.
with very modest goals, and then we expanded. Um, and I think the main thing we had, one of our main diplomatic tasks was frankly inside the building, inside of the State Department, trying to show people that we could help them be more successful in their own strategic goals if they included the analytical tools and relationships that we had formed in their own work. So we could have been the
Right.
people who came in and said, "Oh,
Right.
we're just smarter than the rest of you, and you poor folk will never be as smart as we are. So just get out of the way." Now we would have cratered and burned literally within days if that had been our attitude. So we adopted a posture of collaboration, of trying to come alongside people. We worked a lot with embassies and training their staff and trying to help them gain the
Mm,
capacity to interpret facts on the ground in their host country. And I looked for people who knew how to interact and to be positive and how to be collaborative both inside the State Department and beyond it. And I think we achieved that. I think we built a remarkable team of people with the skill set to work with the existing State Department, but then also help the department engage with new communities and new people that historically they had not had access to or interest in.
that's amazing. So, here I have like this question, and I know that it's going to be kind of obvious. It's going to be subjective, and it's going to be
Sure.
kind of difficult to answer. But I'm very curious because as you're running this department, and you had to have a particular view or definition, even if you didn't weren't sure about it, you had an operational definition of religion, right? So
No,
what
no,
would be
no, we
no,
didn't. No, no. In fact,
no.
we avoided that because
Oh, really? So tell me. So what's going on there? So how did you know when something was religious or not? How did you determine yes, this is a religious consideration versus this isn't?
well, so first of all, if you want to start a fight in any university or college in America today, walk into the religion department and say, "I have the be all end all final definition of religion
I
that
have the
will
definition of religion.
you will you will be joining an unending battle." So if a State Department office is not going to have of 30, 30, 35 people, there was no way we could come up with a mutually universally acceptable definition of religion. And if the experts can't do
Right.
it, why in the world would I try to do that in a State Department office? So, but a lot of scholars said, "Oh well, you really did. You had a clandestine definition," and I defy anybody to find that. I defy anybody to ask anybody who worked for us to say, "No, really, come on, show us." So it was a much more
What
pragmatic
was the
approach.
definition?
Yeah, we didn't have it. So pragmatically, what it meant was that sometimes we were called in to look at an issue set in a country and say, "Oh, help us find the religious thread here." And we looked at it, and either we said, "We don't see anything," or B, "We don't see anything that's significant politically or diplomatically." So we weren't
Mm,
looking just for religion per se. We were looking for how religious dynamics may have emerged or been interwoven into
mm.
particular political issues.
So
So we
what was the methodology that you used?
it
Like
was
how did
eclectic.
you
It was eclectic, and I hired people who had been trained in different schools of religious studies
mm,
because
mm,
that was purposeful, that the more sets of eyes that we put onto a situation, the less likely we were to be theoretically trapped before we
right.
actually showed up and looked around and asked, what is going on here?
Because
Uh,
the idea is that if you come in with preconceived notions about what that religion is, how those religious people act, you're going to come in with a bias that
right.
might bias you against actually even figuring out what's going on.
That's right. Or you might even make it worse. And the classic case there is with respect to Islam. Uh,
Mm. Yeah, I was
you
going to ask for a concrete example of something, a time when a religious misunderstanding, like not even, I know you talk about the whole chapter of the Iraq War, but a specific instance where religious misunderstanding resulted in tragic results.
Well, I mean, the classic case was in Iraq when we early in the invasion, when Paul Bremer ran the provisional authority that we set up. We basically set up sort of a an interim government, and there was really nobody on Paul Bremer's senior staff who understood the first thing about the religious dynamics of Iraq, which is insane
Mm.
when you think about it. A
Yes.
country as large, with heritages as old as they are in Iraq,
Thousands of years.
and you've got very, very complex dynamics within the plurality of religions there in within Islam and beyond in Iraq. And I go in greater length. I have a whole chapter on Iraq, but the classic one was where basically we, through the provisional authority, wanted to write a constitution for the Iraqis. Now we sprinkled in a few expat Iraqis, but basically
Mm.
we were dictating the terms.
Right.
And the senior Shia Ayatollah Ali Sistani uh, was not consulted in that process. So here's one of the leading religious authorities of the country who has opinions. Now he was not particularly
Mm.
politically engaged before that, um, but Brimmer refused to meet with him. And a Washington Post reporter said that in Brimmer's
Wow.
eyes, Ayatollah Ali Sistani was just another old man with a beard and a turban.
Mm.
And so
Right.
Sistani issued a fatwa saying we do not support the Constitution. Iraqis should be able to write and vote for their own constitution. And the process that we had set up to dictate a constitution collapsed and burned because we didn't have the basic street knowledge, much less the strategic knowledge about the role of Sistani and his supporters, and
Mm.
it led to all kinds of disasters after that.
It's like we
So,
had no idea. I mean, it almost reminds me of like when everyone was like, when Afghanistan Taliban came back in. I know this is obviously much more recent, and they looks like they just welcomed them. They just laid down their weapons and like they didn't even there wasn't even a fight hardly. And it was
well,
like, did we misrepresent? Like, did we forget something? Did we not understand how influential they were? I don't know. I mean,
well, no,
I'm making this stuff up.
yeah,
I
I know.
mean,
I
just
think that's a different case. I think that the intelligence community in the most recent episode radically underestimated the power of the Taliban to actually control the whole country, and the
right.
Taliban moved far faster. So that wasn't necessarily the now. Do we going forward? Do we know all the various parties in terms of the various factions within the Taliban? And if
Right.
we decide we want to engage with them, we've got to master those differences. And I don't think we've done that to this
Yes.
point.
Well,
And
I guess
that's an
my
open question.
thinking, oh, that, yeah, that makes sense. And I guess my thinking, like, when I'm like, why did I bring that up? Well, I guess like, it's like to me almost an example, like the intelligence community misunderstood, right? But it's almost like, did they even want, like, it almost felt like, again, from a, layperson perspective, it almost felt like it almost felt like it was an issue where we just didn't, like, they didn't really want us to be there. And I know we don't have to get into all that, but it's
Yeah.
like we didn't understand. Like maybe they wanted the Taliban, and we assumed that they wanted what we wanted them to have, but maybe they wanted something completely different. I don't know if that, but it's almost like these assumptions that we make about how people think, feel, and especially when it comes to religion, uh, we can make some really tragic assumptions.
Well, yeah, and that's, I mean, again, my major focus was looking at Iraq
Of
back
course,
at
right?
the
Yeah.
time of the invasion. But the irony is that our embassies are in these host countries to do two things. They are to interpret the conditions there back to the United States so we make better policy, but they're also there to interpret America to the host country.
Ooh,
And so the Foreign Service
right.
Corps is staffed with people who are deeply trained in the culture in which they're living. Their our foreign policy, our foreign affairs, our foreign service officers, excuse me, travel the world, and they do 3 year hitches and they move around. And so these folks are incredibly
Mm,
smart. They know history, they know politics, they know economics, they know culture. But when it comes to religion, historically we've never trained our diplomats to interpret religion there
mm,
anywhere, so it's more of a seat of the pants, amateurish at best approach to understanding religion, and that has led to this culture of really being leery or even afraid of looking at religious dynamics. And there's certain parts of the world you're just not going to understand. Like, look at Ukraine today. If you show up in Ukraine and say, "Well, religion is irrelevant here," you're going to miss some of the deepest dynamics
oh my gosh.
driving the conflict. And that was the
Yes.
void, that was the gap that we were trying to close.
And it was like even the same thing it feels like in Russia, because even the way Putin uses religion, whether we think it's genuine or not, what difference does that make? What practical, like, I mean, it makes a difference at some level, but in terms of the what we're dealing with on a practical level, I mean, he's using, right, the religion like for his own purposes. And people do that all the time, and misunderstanding the power of religion is really a mistake.
That's right. And now on the flip side of that too, uh, there are examples where religious communities have provided great energy and great resources for peace, for building sustainable development, for leading to reconciliation. So I wasn't just looking at bad guys. And in fact, that's one of the myths that we tried to knock down. There's some people who say that religion is inherently irrational, it's inherently conflictual, and it should be kept out of politics. Now, they haven't gotten that memo in most of the world, I'm here to report. At the same time, there are people who say, oh,
Right.
religion is the key to everything. Join my religion and peace will break out everywhere. Well, we're
Right.
still waiting for empirical evidence for that on that one. So,
Right.
so our job was neither to suppress nor to enhance, but it was to realistically diagnose where are the religious forces here and what kind of impacts are they having, and how then should we develop a foreign policy in these specific contexts or regions based on that knowledge.
Right.
And so we didn't come in with any preconceptions about, well, religion's always good, or religion is always bad, or this religion's always good, or that religion is always bad. But in the absence of expertise, people fall back either on their guts or they fall back on stereotypes. And we were constantly pushing back against those two
Mm.
impulses.
And it's I love that the stereotypes, like their gut feeling, is that what you're saying? And their stereotypes, like you're
Well,
constantly pushing back the biases and assumptions that people make,
right,
probably both them to America, right, and Americans to them,
right.
right? How they view us and how we view them, and that's amazing. Like what? So what you said that diplomats haven't been trained, right? They weren't classically trained in religion. What's the state now, and why do you think why weren't they trained in religious considerations? Like what led to the place where you came in, and then there was enough need that you had to start this new department that would help diplomats and help people in the government understand religious considerations in these foreign affairs.
Well, one thing you will discover about foreign service officers is they're lifelong learners. I mean, if you move every 3 years into a new country, you're going to have to be
Right.
flexible. You have to be
Yes.
curious. You have to know who to call and where to go for insight and for
It sounds like
information.
I would love to be a diplomat.
Well, I mean, to learn a new language in many cases every tour, to take your family with you every 3 year. I mean, it really it calls for a special breed of person. Not everybody
Yes.
is cut out for this, but that basic curiosity. And openness to learning new
Yes.
cultures, and ability to relate across difference. I mean, those are real skills that you can develop over time. And so we weren't handing out a religion PhD in a can, saying, "Here, add water, stir, mix, and then drink vigorously."
Then you're an expert on
And now
Islam.
you're an expert. Although there were people who did portray themselves as expert, particularly on Islam, who had no experience whatsoever,
Wow.
and so we had to battle a lot of stereotypes. But we've had a lot of foreign service officers and a lot of ambassadors who were grateful that we could come in and say, all right, let us help you understand the dynamics there, but let's train you to keep monitoring and building relationships with these communities, because ultimately you can't do that from Washington, D.C. You can only do that from an embassy that's located in this country. Um, so the Foreign Service has a Foreign Service Institute, which is an ongoing sort of training college that offers courses both in DC but also regionally out in the field. We did some trainings in specific embassies where we would come in. We would help people develop a landscape of the religious communities in their own country. We would introduce them to the leaders. We then tried to introduce them to sort of lay people as well, non clergy
Hmm.
types, and simply give them a set of skills and techniques to begin to understand in a deeper way what was going on in that host country. And we made some progress on that, but at the end of the Obama administration, when the new folk came in, they no longer needed our services, and they were no longer interested in this kind of work.
Really?
Well, I think the Trump folk demonstrated that the downside to the brain surgery analogy.
Oh
uh,
man.
I think they approached religion primarily through the lens, a peculiar version of the lens of international religious freedom, and much of their effort in the international religious freedom domain was really about currying favor with a couple of domestic religious political communities that were going to help them in the reelection. And so
Mm.
that's a case where I think they did damage. I'm not going to say they were fatal to American diplomacy, but they closed our office down. And now here we are 2 years into the
Mm.
Biden administration, and they have not restarted the office. And the final chapter of my book talks about how I think they should restart it, and if they do, what might it look like? What lessons did we learn that might be helpful to a new administration that might want to restart this kind of effort?
So they closed down something that was giving education and consulting on major religious issues.
Mm-hmm.
They took up a religious freedom mantle, but you said peculiar version. What do you mean by that?
Well,
Define
so
that.
uh, in 1998, Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act, which established
Hmm.
an Office of International Religious Freedom in the State Department, created an ambassador slot to run that office, and then it
Hmm.
created an independent entity that was supposed to last 4 years called the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And they were really afraid, Congress or certain people in Congress were afraid that the Clinton administration was going to screw that up. But we can't trust them to do religious freedom right. So we have this independent commission that's going to wag its finger every year and kind of keep
Right.
them in line. But it was only supposed to last 4 years. Now, maybe only in Washington D.C., where we now have had 27 years of that independent commission, would that still be
Right.
seen as a temporary oversight body? But there it is, and and that's where a big partisan uh, energy got injected into international religious freedom, and just to be blunt, that I think a lot of conservative Republicans who were kind of at the forefront of starting this Office of International Religious Freedom have felt through the years that's really our thing. It's our baby because, Democrats hate Christians and Democrats
Right,
hate
right,
religion and blah, yada, yada, yada. Um, and so that then was the space that office during the Trump years. That was the space where a lot of people came through. They put up the Muslim ban, which was an attempt to translate President Trump's call for banning all Muslims from coming into the United States. It took them 2 or 3 tries to get a piece of legislation that could pass a judicial review.
hmm.
But it's hard to say you're for religious freedom for all while simultaneously saying we don't want Muslims to come into this country. You,
Yes,
you can't square that
yes,
circle, right? Um,
right.
and now I think that the Biden administration is sort of cleaning up Dodge, if you will. I think we have a great ambassador there, Rashad Hussein, who's bringing that office back to combating religious persecution, no matter who it is that's being persecuted around the world, and
Right.
getting out of the business of sort of currying favor with conservative Christians. So I'm really glad that they redeemed that space. I hope that they can move
Yes.
into this other space and restore the capacity that we had back in the Obama administration.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What I'm sure as you work through in the State Department and worked with many diplomats, what were some of the ethical dilemmas and challenges that you saw when they're working with religious actors, partners, people? Like, what kind of things that they, I don't know if there was shades of gray or whatever. I don't know, like how people, like what kind of ethical considerations and really challenges that would you guys face as people were working through this?
Well, I mean, I don't think we faced many great deep moral dilemmas. I mean, I think what we faced was a lot of curiosity. People were wondering, well, why do you guys care about us now? To this point, we've never had some pointy headed bureaucrat come from Washington and want to talk to us. Why are you here now? And so it was
Mm,
curiosity. And really, frankly, not hostility. And now I met in I went to Palestine several times, for instance, and I met a lot of Christian folk there, a lot of Muslims, and some of the clerics there were like, we're not happy with what your country has done in our part of the world for the last 30 years, and they would give me a litany of their complaints, and it wasn't my job to argue with them to say no, you're wrong, and usually at the top of that list was your invasion of the Iraq War. And that was an easy one for me. I said, yeah, you're right. That was a mistake. We should not have done that. And there were a lot of folks who, after I said that, would
hmm.
kind of give me this look like, wait a minute, you're an American diplomat and you're repudiating something your former government has done. And I thought, yeah, I think that
Like,
was a
yeah, that
mistake.
gets us killed here.
Yeah. So uh, we were there to try to build relationships, and I never. I mean, no one ever walked out on me. No one ever threw anything at me. Now there was a fair amount of animosity at times.
You didn't get a shoe thrown at you?
No shoes thrown. Maybe some of my own
Hmm.
staff wanted to throw a shoe. I mean, I don't know, but that never happened either. Um, so I just think the overall term I think that describes a lot of American diplomacy has been reticence. People are afraid to go in
Mm,
because they don't know about religious leaders. They don't have a personal experience in a religious community. And, to be a diplomat means you're willing to walk into a room sometimes where the cultural political gulf is decades, even hundreds of years old. And you
mm,
have to have an ability to walk into that room and try to build a relationship when there's not a lot of stuff, historical material to work on. And that's fine. Not everybody's cut out for that work. But we did develop a sort of approach that we would go in, we would try to signal respect, and if we knew tangibly what some of these communities had done around the world or in their own neighborhood, we praised them, we thanked them for that work, and then we'd said, we're here. I'm here to ask you questions, to learn about what the view is from your community about the issue, political issue that's brought us there. And that ultimately was what we were getting at, so that I could go back to the states and represent their view accurately in the policy discussions. And most people,
Mm,
again, I don't want to essentialize all religious leaders, but most religious leaders love to be asked their opinions.
of course.
And most religious leaders are happy to talk your arm off once they've been asked.
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
not always true. I've met some quiet, even reticent religious leaders, but that's not the dominant model. And even those folks, once they get comfortable, are willing to talk at great length. So my job was to get past all the awkward history, the lack of history, but then get to a point where we could have a frank conversation where they could educate me so that I could educate diplomats, and then build a relationship help them build a relationship with the local embassy or consulate so that they could have an ongoing relationship.
So, how did you balance your personal faith with your professional role as a diplomat and as a leader in the State Department coming in, and like what impact did it have on you as you move forward, and how did you balance that?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is we were not there uh, as sort of a manifestation of modeling to the public interreligious dialogue. We were there for the policy piece of it. Now
Right.
we did build a religiously diverse staff. We had folks there who were very devout. We had other folks there that I'm not sure had ever had a personal religious thought in their lifetime, and that was fine, because I was looking for people who could interpret religion around the world, not necessarily be great
Right.
public practitioners. But I will say the issues, we when I landed at the State Department, the White House had just completed a national strategy for uh, engaging religious communities and religious actors and integrating that into U.S. foreign policy. And the three major areas they pointed us to were supporting sustainable development, promoting human rights, and mitigating conflict. Now, as a Christian theologian, I endorse all three of those things. Those are central to my faith,
Right.
and I can defend them in specifically Christian grounds, even though that's not what I was doing. I was not called to do that.
Sure.
So what we were doing is we were trying to build a staff that had overlapping interests in promoting those kinds of values in our foreign policy, and that was not particularly controversial. We did a lot of learning though on the side, and I guess the closest we got to this is that we wrote a list of office values, and I talk about this a lot in the book. My
Hmm.
chief of staff is Jewish, and she's the daughter of a Jewish rabbi, and so she and I had similar values in terms of how do you build an office, how do you treat people, how do you build an office culture. And she and I crafted this list of 4 or 5 values. It wasn't St. Paul. It was not Maimonides. It wasn't, but it was just sort of common sense things like find joy in your work, be a learning community, drive out fear, uh, be collaborative, and basically be a family and relationship friendly environment. I mean, there were times over the course of our 4 years where life happened. Parents died, children were born, children grew up, people got sick. And we wanted to build an environment where if the phone rang and you needed to go, you went. And we covered for you, we supported each other. And so we worked very hard to create a set of values and live into them. And the last thing I think that did for us is that it allowed for some accountability. That if I did something that violated that list, somebody could come in and say, "Shaun, will help us understand. Why did you
Mm.
throw that chair in that meeting last week? How does that comport with being a collaborative work environment?" And for the most part, I think we lived into that. But that was not explicitly religious. But I think it was an overlapping consensus
Mm.
that we ought to be able to get along with each other, and if we don't, how in the world will we have any credibility both in the building but outside the building if
Wow.
we get the reputation for being a bunch of self-important mean people? And So
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah, totally. It makes me think like you guys had to get a sense of like, here are some best practices. We need some values because how are we gonna, how are we gonna interact when we have very different ideas, very different assumptions and worldviews? And I'm sure you learned all sorts of lessons and best practices in your time there in the State Department. How have you taken those, or what are some of those lessons and best practices, and how can they be applied, or even have you applied them in different situations, and how could you be applied maybe in my life or in the life of my neighbor or in between me and my friend Omar who's Muslim and I'm a Christian pastor. How do we like what kind of lessons did you learn that you could take and say, hey Josh, you could do this and this could help you, or are there those kinds of things?
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that the values we drew up about how we're going to comport ourselves in our as employees of the State Department. I think those axioms will go a long way. I think if you treat people with respect, if you are willing to drive out fear, you're trying to help people find joy. I guess that was our first one: find joy in your work. And I we didn't need people who wanted to be somewhere else. We didn't need people who wanted to be working in economics instead of with religious communities. Uh, and I think we live in an age of anxiety today. In my other hat, I have been an academic. I've taught at a graduate theological seminary.
Right.
I've taught undergraduates at Georgetown. I've taught graduate students at Harvard Divinity School.
Mm,
And I think most human beings want to live joyous lives and want our work
yes.
somehow to be a source of joy. Now, you can't create that for me. I can't create that for
Sure.
you.
Yeah.
But if you're working in any kind of entity, any kind of institution, institutions can kill joy. I mean, in
Oh
individuals,
yeah.
bosses can. I've worked for some
Mm,
horrible bosses. I've worked for some spectacular bosses. I know which I wanted to be when I grew up, if I've ever grown up.
sure.
And so I think just even naming and then asking the question, how can we help the individuals working together here name their source of joy and then pursue it? Um, but in
Hmm.
many work environments, that's soft, touchy feely stuff. That's not getting
Right.
product out the
Yeah.
door. And I think it misses the fact that human beings are much more productive and happy if they feel like their work is attached to those things that make them joyful. So I know it may sound trite, it may sound soft, but I think
No.
if you name that and say that's what we're pursuing in this office, it makes for some just astonishing discussions.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It sounds like it. It's so fascinating how you can take these lessons and these things that you've learned in other areas of life, and it seems like these universal axioms, right? Which is like what, a universal truth or something like that. That is applicable in many different situations, right? Multiple different situations. And thinking about those best practices and lessons moving forward, and the State Department, right? We've gone through two different, transitions now since you were there. We had Trump and then now Biden. What do you imagine is like, how do you envision the future of American diplomacy moving, especially given, it doesn't seem like we're getting any less religious in our world. It might be shifting the patterns, but there's so much religion and so much religious sentiment out there. But what do you envision that it is like the future of America, and what are the opportunities and challenges that you think we are going to face?
Well, I think one of the things that has emerged both on the national stage but also the global stage since I left in 2017 has been the increasing and continuing rise of right wing global populism, where you see
Right.
moves towards authoritarianism. You can just run the list. Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, uh, Modi in India, uh, Trump and the MAGA folks here in the United States. And one of the ironies there is that many times, if not always, when you get these populist leaders, there will be a favored religion uh, where the prime minister or
Right.
president or leader will say, I'm on team X. But it
Right.
doesn't stop there. There's also a targeted set of religions or a targeted religion. And, the
Mm.
classic example now we're seeing is the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States, the rise of anti-Semitism
Mm.
around the world, that that is a tried and true uh, horrible technique of authoritarian governments. In the easy scapegoats here are Jews in many cases. So it's
Mm.
extraordinarily troubling to see the rise of
Yes.
anti-Semitism, but then America's authority and America's ability to address this internationally is undercut by the rise of domestic anti-Semitism. So
Mm.
many of our interlocutors, when you start trying to raise human rights issues like anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, they'll start pointing a finger back at you and say, "Well, wait a minute." Special Representative Casey, you guys are not
Hmm.
perfect on these issues. And it's hard to have those discussions when you have people sitting across the table from you saying you're just a bunch of stinking hypocrites because you don't have your own house in order. And so that troubles me. The increase of interreligious strife here in the United States, in some very troubling, well documented fashions, are now mainstream. We have people running for office who will traffic in Islamophobia, who will traffic in anti-Semitism. And that troubles me deeply, not only for what's happening in our country, but it means our capacity to try to mitigate those forces internationally is also undercut by the reality that our own house is in disorder. So that worries me just a tremendous amount, both domestically and internationally, about the future of America's role in the world.
What do you imagine brought this about? Like, I know obviously that's almost an impossible question in some ways to answer, but if you were to guess, if you were to give an educated guess based on your experience and based on everything, what do you imagine? Like, how did this come about where now we have this strongman politics and what's going on there? Why do you think this happened?
Well, I mean, the theological answer is to simply say that we are all made of crooked timber, to use a certain Christian theologian's language. That
I like
that
that. Yeah.
that Christians certainly should not be surprised that human beings have a lust for power. They have a will
Right.
to dominate others. Now, I hate that, um, but history is full of evidence to suggest we're not all pious from our toenails up to our bald heads. That we are,
Right.
we are all of mixed motive, and we're all capable of doing horrific things. Now that
Yes.
I
I
don't
agree.
I can't graph that historically. Like where's the level
Right,
today?
right, right,
Where's the
right.
hate index? But there is
The hate index,
yeah,
yes.
there is a lot of evidence to suggest that we are in an era now of growing international right wing populism. Now it gets manifested different ways in different contexts, but this religious persecution and this religious valorizing of some groups
Mm,
is on the uptick. And this is not the first time in human history that's been true. But I do think it means that a lot of religious communities have got to grapple with democracy, with liberal democracy, and we are now in an era where
mm,
both in our own country, people are willing to say, well, that election was fake and it was fraud, and we can assault the Capitol and try to prevent the transfer of power. And a lot of that was religiously motivated, which is terrifying.
mm.
So
It is.
we are in a very anxious time, I think. But that's nothing new on the face of human politics. People have always
Right.
followed those impulses. So there's no immediate or permanent solution to that as long as we fallible human beings are in charge of global politics.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I totally agree with you. So I have this is kind of my last big question, and then I have a small follow up.
Sure.
But so we have a lot of different people that listen to the podcast from
Mhm.
a wide variety.
Mhm.
Atheists, Muslims, Hindus, like it's pretty amazing actually. Liberals, conservatives, kind of across that scale and
Mhm.
spectrum. What do you feel like is the lesson that you learned? If you can crystallize it into one lesson, obviously it's going to be somewhat forced
Yeah.
and artificial. But if you can criticize it, I mean, crystallize it into one like kind of lesson that you would want to say to the people that listen to this, like that you think is most important as we're moving forward, um, in living with one another and interacting with one another, what would you say that is?
Well, I think what we proved in our 4 short years was ignoring religion is not productive, particularly when the complexity of religious dynamics in global politics is increasing. Religion is not disappearing as a force, either good or for ill or for mixed outcomes. In our previous strategy, which really wasn't a strategy, it was just sort of an accidental thing of ignoring it, or if we had to deal with it, relying on unsophisticated approaches is not a good answer. But in fact, you can bring innovation to American diplomacy by increasing the conversations you have and increasing the sophistication of watching and following religious dynamics. You're better prepared to deal with whatever emerges politically. And concomitant with that is you can actually build an innovative office at the senior levels of U.S. government that can bring real change and a stronger foreign policy. In our case, was the result. And I think all American citizens should be interested in that. They should believe and support having a more sophisticated approach to a diabolically complex set of issues at the intersection of global religion.
That's so good. That's so good. So, how can people get your book? How can they follow your work? How can people stay up to date with what you're doing?
Well, you can just go to that one stop shop. You can go to Amazon. You can find it at Barnes
Yes,
and Noble. Just if you Google "Chasing the Devil," and you can buy it from the publisher Erdman's as well. So Google is
yes,
your friend. You
yes,
Google me and the title of the book, you will find ways to purchase the book.
absolutely. And do you have any? Are you on Twitter? Are you on social media? Do you do any of that?
Yes, I'm on Twitter at Shaun Casey 57. That's ShaunCasey, the number five, the number seven. You can follow me there on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. You can search on Facebook and find me there. And I'm speaking a lot around the country. If you Google just Shaun Casey and Chasing the Devil, there are videos up, probably 15, 20
Yeah,
videos of conversations I've had. So for good or for
making
ill.
your tours.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Eh,
And I'm having a lot of fun doing that.
I'm sure. What's your next big project?
That's a good question. I'm actually I just got home from what will be my last trip. I was up at Boston speaking at Tufts University at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy with a group of
Awesome.
remarkable students there. So I'm going to recover. I've been on the road for about 8 weeks, so I'm looking for a little time off.
It's about time to recover. Well, that's great. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us. This has been Shaun Casey. Again, you can pick up his book, "Chasing the Devil," at Foggy Bottom. And again, like you Google, we want you to read it. We'll put a link to that where you can get it up in the podcast notes. And thank you so much, Shaun. Really appreciate it. Your time has been really valuable for us.
Well, thanks, Josh. I enjoyed it a lot. Take care.
Absolutely. You too, guys, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. God bless.